this is lecture 12 of the course on the principles of behavioral economics. In this again we are going to continue with our discussion on utility and specifically focusing again on different types of utility. We already introduced experienced utility in the previous module, and so far experienced utility has been described as a unified concept. However, Kahneman draws a useful distinction between remembered utility after the experience and real time utility during the experience. So, instead of having one single concept of experienced utility, we are breaking them up between two alternative possibilities. These are measured in different ways and are relevant for different purposes. Remembered utility is measured using a memory based approach, as the name suggests. This involves a retrospective evaluation of past experience. The concept is therefore subject to bias, in particular the application of the peak end rule. This essentially tries to tell us that we happen to remember something which basically if we go back to the experience or experiencing something, the experience of something that we had, then what we happen to remember is that the experience that we had at the peak and the experience we had at the end. For example, it has been observed in colonoscopy studies by Redelmeier and Kahneman that a prolongation of the duration of pain at a lower level of intensity can lead to a more favorable evaluation. So, if the pain is kept at a lower level, even if it is kept at a longer period of time, still the entire process will be treated more favorably because the peak has not been much. So, because we tend to apply peak end rule, as a result of which it does not peak much, then the understanding would be or the approach towards that particular therapy would be much more favorable. This can also be relevant in decision making if people base decisions on remembered past utility or disutility. Cowley refers to this process as retrospective hedonic editing and draws attention to its dangers in terms of decision making. In particular, it can result in the justification of past indulgences like gambling or overeating, thus leading to a continuation of self-harming behavior. This phenomenon is related to cognitive dissonance, where people adjust their attitudes to be consistent with their behavior. Now, talking about real time utility as opposed to remembered utility, real time utility is measured using a moment based approach. This is a more difficult procedure to implement since it involves a continuous monitoring of the subjects. For example, in the colonoscopy studies, the subjects were asked to rate their pain on a scale of 0, that is no pain at all, to 10, that is intolerable pain, every 60 seconds. This moment based approach can also be used to drive what Kahneman refers to as total utility, which in turn can be used as a measure of objective happiness under certain assumptions. So, here in this context, every 60 seconds, that is every minute, they are asked to rate their pain, and it may continue for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So, the entire rating can be added up in order to arrive at the total utility. There is another aspect of the concept of experienced utility where a distinction is drawn between wanting and liking. Wanting is associated with the motivation aspects of reward, which can be dissociated from liking, which is concerned with the hedonic aspects of reward. Thus, we may want not like something, for example, smoking. So, in this case, we are not liking smoking, and this is what we want to do. So, want and liking can be always separated. There is neuroeconomic evidence for this distinction in terms of different neural systems being involved. It appears that dopamine is associated with the motivation aspects of reward, and disruption of the dopamine system does not impair the hedonic aspects, that is the liking aspect of the reward. An important theory regarding happiness and well-being, not necessarily the same thing, is that people judge their level of these based on the concepts of endowment and contrast effects. This was given by Tarowski and Griffin in 2000. The endowment effect in this context is different from the more celebrated one, where the acquisition of goods causes the acquirer to value the goods more highly than expected. We will be talking about the endowment effect in this sense later, specifically while discussing different types of biases, heuristics or preferences. In the words of Tarowski and Griffin, the endowment effect of an event represents its direct contribution to one's happiness or satisfaction. So, this is strictly in this sense endowment effect is used in this module, where it represents its direct contribution to one's happiness or satisfaction. Good news and positive experiences enrich our lives and make us happier. Bad news and hard times diminish our well-being. So, this is essentially the concept of endowment effect in this context. On the other hand, the contrast effect is an indirect effect what works in just the opposite direction. A positive experience makes us happy, but it also renders similar experiences less exciting. A negative experience makes us unhappy, but it also helps us in assessing similar subsequent experiences as less bad. Contrast effects are particularly important in societies where people are generally becoming more affluent over time, and in this context are often referred to as treadmill effects. Now, talking about treadmill effect, there are two main theories explaining the existence of treadmill effects. The oldest theory explains them in terms of adaptation. This is a hedonic response which can be most easily seen in physiological terms. When subjects immerse one hand in cold water and the other in hot water for a period of time, and then immerse both hands in the same container of lukewarm water, they experience the strange sensation of one hand feeling warm, the one that was previously in cold water obviously, and the other hand which was previously in hot water tend to feel cold. This theory has been used to explain why both lottery winners and paraplegics appear to adjust rapidly to their changed circumstances. Essentially, the treadmill effect talks about getting back to the previous state from after getting a shock. It could be happiness, it could be something sad, some bad news. Nevertheless, after a while people get back to normalcy, the previous level of their mental state. However, not everyone is convinced by the adaptation theory as far as such explanations are concerned. Frederick and Lowenstein proposed a number of reasons why reported happiness may not be reliably measured on the scales used. Kahneman proposed a different mechanism by which treadmill effects can be explained using the term satisfaction treadmill. This explains the phenomenon in terms of aspiration effect. Kahneman explains this effect by using an example of a graduate student who is constrained by her income to eating mediocre dishes when she goes to a restaurant. When she takes a lucrative job, she can afford to consume food of a higher quality and her overall utility increases. However, after a transition period, we observe that her satisfaction returns to its previous level. Her aspiration level has increased and her utility is influenced by her aspiration level. Other things being equal, the higher the aspiration level, the lower the utility. So, as you understand that we all can relate with this, as we go up the ladder of affluency, of course, we get more accustomed to the new style where we are having more and more, that is abundance, and that additional the new level of consumption does not keep on exciting us on a daily basis, we get accustomed to it. So, this is what is happening here as well. In order to give us further stimulation, we need further addition to the source of income, to the source of abundance, to the source of whatever from where we are getting some additional pleasure. Alternatively, we can say that there is no longer a contrast between the dishes she is consuming now and the ones that she was consuming a while ago, just before her income had increased. So, this was sort of aspiration effect. So, the endowment and contrast theory has some interesting applications using all these concepts. In an experiment, subjects were required to spend an hour either in an extremely pleasant room like spacious, nicely furnished and decorated with posters and flowers, or in an extremely unpleasant room. The room was small, dirty, smelly, noisy and overheated. Subjects who are placed in the pleasant room reported higher overall life satisfaction than those in the unpleasant room, showing the dominance of the endowment effect as far as general satisfaction or well-being is concerned. However, subjects placed in the unpleasant room reported higher satisfaction with their housing than those in the pleasant room, showing the dominance of the contrast effect in the context of a relevant standard of comparison. So, basically two things are working here together, one is endowment effect, another is contrast effect. So, what it says is that the subjects that were placed in unpleasant room, when they go back to their own houses, then they find it much better. So, here in this case contrast effect is dominating the endowment effect. Tversky and Griffin concluded that a specific event therefore is likely to have a significant contrast effect in the domain to which it belongs and little or no contrast effect in others. Now, we talk about another type of utility, which is anticipatory utility. As mentioned earlier, people gain hedonic utility from the anticipation of events in the future. For example, by looking forward to a holiday or dreading a visit to the dentist. This anticipatory utility is based on a person's expected or predicted utility. So, whatever you are anticipating in future, whatever you are expecting in future, meaning their belief about the future experienced utility of an event. Again, endowment and contrast effects are relevant here as well. Playing the lottery presents an interesting application, since this type of behavior is not readily explained by the expected utility theory we had talked about in previous modules. Unrealized hopes and fears can give rise to positive or negative endowment in terms of anticipatory utility. The probability of winning a lottery is very low, which means that the failure to win does not cause much disappointment. So, again you can see that through anticipatory utility, endowment and contrast effect are taking place. It is not going to cause much of disappointment, because we do not keep generally very high hope of winning a lottery. So, if we do not win, then it does not disappoint us much. Therefore, as Tversky and Griffin state, the dream of becoming an overnight millionaire could produce enough pleasure to offset the mild disappointment of not winning the lottery. When the positive endowment effect, here the dream of becoming an overnight millionaire is the endowment effect, which is having a positive impact. It outweighs the negative contrast effect. Negative contrast effect is the mild disappointment of not winning the lottery. Then people can enjoy playing the lottery even when they do not win. Just because someone does not win a lottery, no one commits suicide or no one takes a drastic step in life, because they really did not expect to win the lottery. In case they win, then of course, the enjoyment would be tremendous. Nevertheless, a failure to win the lottery does not disappoint people much. Evidence regarding this anticipatory utility comes from a study by Kosher, Krozek and Van Winden in 2014, who conducted an experiment with real lottery tickets and found that a substantial minority of subjects preferred delayed resolution of risk, that is, they preferred to wait longer for the results. Again, this shows that the endowment effect is stronger. People are not interested in the result because they know that the winning possibilities are very low. Rather, they are getting much pleasure by daydreaming what if they win the lottery. They also prefer to spread outcomes in terms of preferring two tickets in separate draws rather than in the same draw, thus prolonging the period of anticipation, or maybe adding to your anticipation or positive endowment effect. It should be noted that the contrast effect appears to be highly sensitive to the probability of winning or losing. As the probability of winning increases, the costs of the disappointment of losing, that is the contrast effect, appear to increase more quickly than the benefits from the hope of winning, that is the endowment effect. So, as you can see that so far we were discussing that the endowment effect was actually dominating the contrast effect, but if the probability of winning is high, then it is quite possible that when I am not able to win the lottery, I will be extremely disappointed. In that case, my endowment effect will be dominated by the contrast effect, and I will be overall very skeptic about investing in those lotteries. The implication of this is that for a given expected value, people should tend to prefer long odds situations. Long odds situation implies situations having lower probability of being positive rather than short odds. Short odds here implies that higher probability of say winning the lottery, which implies that they have sweeter dreams and milder disappointment. So, long odds situations where winning probabilities are actually low, you have sweeter dreams and milder disappointment, as compared to short odds, that is where winning probabilities are high actually. Then if you do not win, that would lead to huge amount of disappointment, and that disappointment may outweigh the dreams that we are having during the period of waiting or anticipation. Next we talk about residual utility. Whereas anticipatory utility looks forward to future events, understandably residual utility relates to pleasure or pain felt at later periods of time in separate episodes. For example, a person may gain anticipatory utility regarding going on holiday in Hawaii for a month before the actual event, then enjoy the holiday for a week, and then may suffer a contrast effect when they return to work. However, suppose a month later, they may feel another utility boost related to the same holiday experience when they reminisce with friends. How was the holiday? How was the vacation in Hawaii? That was great. When you look at the pictures, when you look at the videos, when you just think about or memorize or remember what fun we had there, then that basically gives us utility, some satisfaction again and again. That is called the residual utility. These later episodes may be repeated at various intervals after the original experience to which they relate. Thus, residual utility arises from reminiscence. Residual utility can also be negative if someone dwells on a bad experience in the past. For example, thinking about the time when they had a match point in a tennis championship, but then went on to lose the match. Similarly, as we took the example of colonoscopy, the moment those incidents are remembered, that inflict some kind of sense of pain or negative utility. So, there are also instances of residual utility when I think about bad events that have happened in the future and then get some negative utility out of it. Next we talk about diagnostic utility. Diagnostic utility refers to the situation where people infer their utility from their actions. For instance, while deciding whether to have or not have an alcoholic drink, we should not just consider the experienced or hedonic utility of the good consumed, that is the pleasure that one would be getting by having the alcoholic drink. We should also consider the utility to be inferred from the action of consumption in terms of signaling the vice of a weak will or the virtue of a strong will. So, for instance, I am suggested not to drink alcohol, whether I will be able to resist myself or not. If I am able to resist myself, that is a signal of having a strong will. So, that is considered to be a virtue, and I will be also getting some satisfaction out of that. So, that is basically diagnostic utility. It is possible that the negative diagnostic utility of an action outweighs the positive expected experienced utility related to the good consumed. In this case, the person will abstain from consumption. Therefore, the phenomenon that is relevant here is the process of self signaling, which is particularly important for people who are uncertain where they stand in terms of certain personal attributes, for example, the possession of strong willpower. Evidently, what it is meant here is that negative diagnostic utility of an action, for example, if I am not supposed to drink alcohol, still I indulge in it. So, that will give me some negative diagnostic utility. If that is very strong, then it is quite possible the pleasure or positive experienced utility that I would be getting by drinking the alcohol would be outweighed by this negative diagnostic utility. So, overall I will be worse off. I probably would regret drinking so much that the enjoyment of drinking would be gone. So, this is what the situation when we say that negative diagnostic utility prevails, and that is why it is more about the process of self signaling. The significance of this is that temptation should not just be seen as a cost, it can also bring a benefit. Thus, a dieting person may experience hunger as residuality, but simultaneously gain the benefit of positive diagnostic utility in terms of improving self-esteem if they refrain from eating. So, by exercising self-control, I will be getting some positive utility which may outweigh my negative utility which is generated by hunger. If the dieter feels no hunger, for example, if they have had gastric band surgery, they will not gain such diagnostic utility. So, this concept of diagnostic utility has widespread applications as well. Then we talk about transaction utility. The neoclassical model frames the net value of a purchase as benefit minus cost. Benefit would be modeled as most often utility, and cost will involve accounting cost as well as opportunity cost. In reality, the phenomenon of loss aversion makes this coding of the purchase hedonically inefficient. Both Kahneman and Tversky and Taylor therefore reject the idea that costs are necessarily viewed as losses. Here the idea is that every day we make several purchases, and since we have not talked about prospect theory as well, but an important contribution of prospect theory is that it suggests that losses pinches us more than double the pleasure that we get from gain. So, this is my pain and this is my gain. What they say is that the pain pinches us more than double, more than twice than the pleasure that I would be getting from gains. So, if that is so, having said this, what I want to mean is that if costs are treated as losses, then it can be proved and argued that we will never be able to make any purchases. This is because I purchase say a pen for 10 rupees. So, my gain is the pen that I received, my loss is the 10 rupees that I have paid. Now, if losses pinch me twice the amount of pleasure that I will be getting from gain, then of course, I will never be able to make the purchase, because I will be always bothered about spending the pain would be say in terms of utility more than 20 utils, while the gain from the pen would be just 10 utils. So, I will never be able to make purchases. So, there are every day a large number of purchases we make, small purchases, right, and as a result of which we cannot look at costs as losses. That is not possible. If we look at costs as losses, then we will never be able to make purchases. Taylor proposes instead that there are two types of utility that consumers gain from a transaction. The first one is acquisition utility. This represents the value of the good obtained relative to its price, equivalent to the concept of consumer surplus. We will be talking about acquisition utility at length while discussing mental accounting. The other concept is of transaction utility. This corresponds to the perceived value of the deal, in other words the difference between the reference price and the price paid. So, this is what also we are going to transaction utility we are also going to talk at length while discussing mental accounting, but very briefly what we can discuss here is that the reference price may often be the price that the consumer expects to pay for the good. So, for example, suppose I want to buy a bottle of juice or maybe 1 liter Tetra Pak of juice, I expect the price to be around 100 or 120 depending on the brand, maybe 150, 180 whatever. So, let us consider a price of 150 for a bottle of juice. Now, this is my expected price, we are calling it the reference price, and transaction utility will be there if the price that I finally pay is much lesser than the reference price. So, if I am getting this juice at a discount for say 120 rupees, then I will be receiving some transaction utility. Taylor noted two important implications of the transaction utility component. The first is that people are often tempted to buy deals where transaction utility dominates acquisition utility. So, when you are primarily driven by deal, then you would end up purchasing certain things that probably will never be used or maybe not the most desirable thing. For example, personally one can experience, everybody might have experienced similar things and relate to this kind of concept. For example, someone ends up buying a piece of clothing which is not of his or her size. Say I buy something which is nearly double my size, but I purchased it just because I got a very good deal. Now, I was very excited to get say 80% discount on the product. I brought the product home, but when I tried it, I found it is not fitting me well altogether. So, it has been lying in my cupboard for say several years, because since I got it of a deal, I really like to hold on to it. Of course, one day I will be throwing it away. There are also specific terms for that. We will not talk about them in detail here. Nevertheless, the purchase happened just because I found it as a very good deal. Marketing strategists skillfully manipulate the framing of offers using reference prices and emphasizing savings. Examples of such goods are clothing, household gadgets and health club membership. Very often you would say that in the e-commerce websites that they would write in bigger fonts the amount of money that you have saved. Suppose you are paying for something 2000 rupees, and they will write or emphasize on the amount saved. They would say that you have saved 4000 rupees on this. So, this is where they are trying to remind you of the deal, that is exploiting your transaction utility. The other implication relates to the opposite situation, where people forego goods that have the potential to benefit the consumer in terms of acquisition utility, but are rejected because of a high perceived transaction disutility. This is a situation, for example, you do not fly frequently, you visit to the airport for the first time, and you realize that probably all the prices are much higher as compared to what you get to see in local stores. So, a bottle of water which you can purchase in a local store for 20 rupees would be sold for 100 rupees in an airport. As a result of which, you might not purchase the bottle of water despite being very thirsty, or while you are flying, one cup of coffee may cost you 200 rupees. You are generally familiar with a similar cup of coffee for 50 rupees on the ground. So, you think that there is huge transaction utility, though you are having you are very much feeling like going for a cup of coffee, still you may control yourself, because here your acquisition utility, that is the utility gained from consuming the cup of coffee, is dominated by your transaction utility. You have huge amount of negative transaction utility, because of which you are not willing to pay for the coffee despite of very strongly feeling the need for it. So, here in this situation, because of high perceived transaction disutility, people at times end up not buying certain things which otherwise may benefit them. An additional dimension involved in these sorts of decision could be the notion of fairness as well. At times we also consider certain things to be unfair. Charging a price of 200 rupees for a cup of coffee may appear unfair to some individuals. So, it is setting aside the concept of deal, setting aside your requirement for drinking a cup of coffee. There could be a third thing also into play, and that third thing is that you consider it to be unfair to charge you so heavily. More recent research has added some nuances to the concept of transactional utility. For example, it has been reported that consumers perceive the deal to be better if they believe that the offer is more valuable than the marketer intended. Alternatively, competitive consumers gain utility if they believe they are outsmarting the market. Basically, your perception of the deal is actually better than or more valuable than the marketer intended. So, these are completely subjective understanding or evaluation. This has important counterintuitive policy implications for marketers in terms of targeting promotions, a strategy normally regarded as desirable. With this, I come to the conclusion of this lecture or module. These are the additional references that have been followed. Thank you.